New York, and everywhere really, I mean, building is a political undertaking as well as an economic one, and a matter of dreaming big and designing. What's unique about the political process of building in New York, and what advantages do you see in that, and what challenges do you see in that?
Well, as you noted, it's a very, very competitive in New York City, and New York City is by large part, is a city of islands, and the land is very constrained. It is said that all conversations in New York come back to real estate, and there is some real truth to that. The development management is hyper-competitive in New York City, and to be able to build a building, the process is quite onerous, quite expensive. However, it is also transparent and very thoughtful. So even though it can be very difficult to build a building in New York City, the end result is generally one of very high quality. And that is a result of many different things, two major things. One is the very thoughtful, although somewhat Byzantine process of getting a building entitled, permitted, and built. And the other, in large part, is the very skilled workforce that we have here in New York City.
Mm-hmm. Are you hopeful that some of that Byzantine process will get simpler?
I can't say that I'm hopeful that it will become simpler at any point in the very near future. It is a difficult process, but again, it is a very there is quite a bit of thought behind it.
Tell us about cogeneration, what it is, and how you use it in some of your buildings.
So cogeneration is the notion that you produce electricity at the site of your building and then use the heat that is a byproduct of that electrical generation to either heat or cool your building. So it is very efficient for a couple of different reasons. One, you are producing the electricity on site and therefore not losing energy during the transmission process, which is what happens when a building plugs into the grid. And secondly, you are using that byproduct for heat or for cooling. So we started out doing this in the early 2000s. In 2005, we had some very small cogeneration micro turbines, 500 kilowatts each, that were not very successful. When we built One Bryant Park, which opened in 2008, we had a 5 megawatt cogeneration facility, which has been very successful for us.
And what has changed that's making it easier to incorporate cogeneration successfully over time?
Well, unfortunately, what has changed is that the technology has improved significantly. So what we installed in 2008 has only improved very significantly. What has made it more difficult is the fact that to tie your cogeneration facility into the grid, the equipment that is required as part of that installation into the grid is very expensive, and the standby charges that the local public utility charge have increased very significantly, 14% year over year since we installed the cogeneration facility at One Bryant Park.
What's a standby charge?
So a standby charge is the charge that a local public utility will charge to stand by to provide you electricity. So we do not provide our own backup at the Bank of America. So if that cogeneration facility were to shut down because of failure or for maintenance, we need the grid to be on standby. And the local public utility rightfully charges you or charges us a rate to be on standby. What we think is perhaps unfair is the rate at which they have increased over time. We don't see a logic behind that.
It's interesting that theoretically your building could be generating 100% of its own energy on site, but still need to pay a utility for power from the grid, even if it doesn't use that power.
We could generate quite a bit of the building's energy demand. It's not quite 100%. Sometimes we reach peak loads up to 13 megawatts. So we definitely do need the local public utility to provide additional electricity as well as to be on standby. But it is distressing to us that we cannot run the cogeneration facility during times of power outage. We are required to shut it down and use a much more impactful, and by impactful I mean greenhouse gas emissions, method of providing electricity with diesel generators.
Are there any physical constraints, technical reasons why cogeneration is harder to incorporate in certain circumstances in New York, with the aging infrastructure here?
I think that the aging infrastructure is only bolsters the argument for distributed cogeneration facilities that are independent, that can be run independently of the grid. During power outages, a cogeneration facility should be able to provide the building with electricity at a time when the building needs it the most. And that is the direction that we are moving in with our most recent development at Howlett's Point, where we plan to be, with the exception of a natural gas interconnect, to be completely independent of the grid and be able to provide our own backup and provide electricity during times of power outages.
I get the economic incentive and the environmental incentive for doing this case by case. It certainly makes sense. You want to have control of your own power. But could you articulate, what drew you to this idea in the first place? Was it just a cost benefit that it would pay off in a certain number of years, or did you want to remain as independent as possible from the grid for reasons of, the infrastructure that they're dealing with, or something else entirely? What drew you to this idea in the first place?
The main thing that drew us to this initially was our effort to make our buildings as sustainable as possible. And the cogeneration facilities, as I mentioned before, will use essentially 1/3 less electricity as if you are tied into the electrical grid. So because you are using less source energy, you are therefore having less impactful CO2 emissions.
So in terms of lowering CO2 emissions, it's also important that your tenants are turning the lights off or operating the building correctly on a large level, that your building manager knows how to work with the building. What sort of user education programs have you employed on some of your buildings in order to reduce its environmental footprint?
We have employed a number, and we are in the process of employing more. In 1999, when we completed 4 Times Square, we provided guidelines so that tenants could fit out their spaces in a sustainable manner. And those guidelines included suggestions to have occupancy sensors and other energy-saving features incorporated into their tenant fit-outs. Right now, we are in the process of working with facility managers and providing facility managers of our tenants with the tools so that they can monitor their electrical usage appropriately. We have started with our biggest tenants, specifically Bank of America. Bank of America has its own group of engineers, and our engineers and their engineers have worked very closely to stage equipment so that it is geared up appropriately and the building is cooled progressively rather than starting all equipment up at once. And we are also in the process of designing a tenant portal where the facility managers will be able to monitor their electrical usage. That rollout will take about a year. Another program is we are enrolling in a demand management system to curtail buildings load during times of peak loads, usually in the summer. And we're hopeful that we can work with the facility managers, with many of our tenants, to help curtail load during those high demand times.
Here's a general question. What's something that you learned recently about how to design, develop, or operate a building that you intend to incorporate in a future building, or that's piqued your interest?
What is something I've learned recently?
Yeah, is there another building or interaction you've had, not necessarily since being here, but in recent months that you're excited to employ in one of your buildings in the future?
What I would like to do is employ more cutting-edge technology that we have not previously employed. There seems to be some very exciting developments in the Internet of Things, sensors that can be distributed throughout a building to monitor temperature, humidity, and the like, so that you can monitor things without having to be hardwired into those sensors. The notion of using drones to inspect facades sounds very interesting to me. It is essentially a year-round process to inspect a facade and repair it in New York City with the great size of the facades and the limited windows of time in which you can actually get out onto a building maintenance unit and actually look at the facade. So drones, I think, would be very helpful. At construction sites, I think there's a lot that construction companies can be doing for quality control using smart technologies. We hire construction managers, so that would be up to them to try and implement those things. But things to accurately monitor the number of workers that are on site, monitor their certifications, OSHA or otherwise, I think are all very exciting technologies.